What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Don't Waste Your Hate podcast. This is episode 6. We got another guest here for you. And if you remember way back to episode 5, we had a guy named Carmine. This is another blood relative. His name is Rob. I've known him personally for a few years, and best thing I know about him, or the two things that I know about him, is number one, he's like a crazy engineer type dude who decided his main project that he wanted to get into was converting a propane heater into a natural gas heater for his deck. And the next thing is that he throws a pretty good Halloween party. So Rob, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And of course we got Jeff here as usual.
So,
and we're just going to discuss this this little tiff going on with Google. The basic of it is a guy named James Damore, an employee at Google, put out a memo regarding the diversity issue and specifically gender diversity. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Rob, why don't you just let us know what it was all about?
Yeah, so this guy, James Damore, wrote an internal memo essentially to his coworkers at Google outlining, describing a ideological echo chamber, a leftist ideological echo chamber at Google. And he talks about how this ideological echo chamber influences their business, has permeated into their diversity program, and essentially is not good for business, is not good for the atmosphere of the employees. And he challenges, why are we implementing the diversity programs that we have here? We think we're doing something that's good, that's valuable. And he challenges that, and he challenges it essentially with a bunch of scientific research. Wrote this fantastic paper, and it's not that long. It's only a couple pages. I pulled it up and read it, 4 or 5 minutes. It really doesn't take that long. And it's extraordinarily well written. And it's written from the perspective of, I am a Google employee, and I know that there are other Google employees here, specifically conservative employees, who feel like their opinion or their voice is being silenced because of this ideological, authoritarian, leftist echo chamber that exists here at Google. This is not good for business. This is not good for our employees. So he lists the grievances and why they're grievances, but then he lists what are corrective actions that the company can take to make it better. So this isn't like a whiny piece from some guy who just has an axe to grind with upper management. He actually wrote this as like an instructive document to the company. Hey, here's issues that I see with what the company's doing. Here's how we can make the company better. And ultimately, they fired him over it, which is obviously pretty insane. To me, it's like if I took my spare time and wrote up a 10-page memo to upper management to say, hey, here's how we can make our business better. And they said, good job, by the way, you're fired. So it was pretty, I can't say that I'm surprised by it at all, but it's obviously quite disturbing.
Yeah, and a little background on the guy, before we get into the substance of the memo, background on the guy from what I understand is he's like basically very intelligent guy. He was like a chess champion. He was picked in like some kind of coding contest. That's how he originally was hired by Google.
Yeah, like
he did
social network style.
Yeah. So this guy had nothing to do with work performance, obviously. It's like he was performing well at work. He was a good, I guess he was a software engineer or coder.
Well, they said he explicitly he was fired for breaking their code of conduct, right?
Right. Exactly. Obviously, they have a right to fire whoever they want. However, Google is a very powerful force on the internet. They control quite a bit of the real estate on the internet and quite a bit of how you get to other real estate on the internet. And it is somewhat disturbing, or at least it should be, in my mind, somewhat disturbing to people who are of a conservative or libertarian bent that Google has this much power. And it's fine if they want to, if all the upper management have these leftist tendencies, it's not a problem. But when they are having it permeate through their company, that's when I feel like it becomes somewhat of an issue. And I think that's what this guy's trying to address. And, it's a little bit troublesome in my mind because of that. Of course, they have the right to fire him, but it's what is Google? Google runs YouTube. They run Google. They control quite a bit.
Well, yeah. So from the leftist position, this is where they sort of tie themselves into knots. Where it's like I can make an argument right now that I really don't believe in, but would be consistent with them. So a lot of the people on the left want to make arguments for certain things becoming public utilities and therefore like rights, and sort of falls into those types of categories, which changes, the whole game in terms of, it's just a private company. They're like, when they started saying that internet access is now a right, just like water, and everyone can have it and all that stuff. And now you can force these companies and people to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So from that perspective, if you're taking that view Google is certainly large enough and important enough and ingrained into like all the technology where a lot of the people working there and that are upset by this and fired him over this would make that argument. And I fucking totally forgot what my connecting point was there.
Well, just to bring, I think larger.
Good start to
the larger aspect of this that I think is interesting and probably bad is right now we live in a political climate that is very divided. There's almost no center. You're either way to the left or way to the right. You're either 100% right or 100% wrong. There's no center. And this guy obviously is a little bit conservative. But if you read this piece, the language that he uses, it's almost like the way I talk to my wife. Because when I have to give her bad news, you're going to be very nice about the way you deliver the information. Make sure you're very specific about things. I mean, he says in here several times, because he talks about aggregate groups of people and the statistical average. And he specifically says, you can't use this to judge any individual person. In fact, he says explicitly, my whole point of this is that we stop treating people as groups and treat them as individuals. I mean, this guy is, if you read this just top to bottom, it's not even remotely offensive. When I saw the headlines for this, I tried not to read any article. I tried to get the text, to read the text for myself before I got my mind polluted by the nonsense that people write as interpretations of this. And I read this and I immediately said to myself, there's not going to be one article that has a quote from this paper, because there's not one offensive quote from the paper. Right. And I am yet to find anything. And that's how you know right off the bat whether or not something is legitimately offensive or bad. Usually they'll take a little snippet that somebody said out of context. I mean, there's not even something in here you could take out of context of being sexist or offensive or rude or malicious in any way, shape, or form.
So, not that it matters so much in terms of like why this is a story and why we're talking about it, but in your read of it, what did you think of the actual content, his conclusions?
I think it's very clear to me, and I found out later that this guy's actually done research at universities. It's very clear to me that he knows how to research a topic, how to lay out an argument, how to cite supporting information, scientific information. And then, like I said, the best part is he gives recommendations for corrective actions as to how to actually make it better. But to my previous point, the problem that I have with this is a guy who's very reasonable. I mean, this is not a guy way off on the right or way off on the left. I get it if the guy came out and said, sexist things and stuff like that, and you can debate and say, well, he has the right to say these sexist things. Well, Google has the right to kick him out, and they have a right to fire whoever they want. That's fine. But the problem is, here's a guy that's about as reasonable as it gets, about as logical as it gets, down the middle of the ideological spectrum almost, okay? And then he gets demonized and kicked out of the company, which to me is like it's just further dividing people into bins of left and right.
What's funny too is he's complaining of an echo chamber, and if he's correct, then they just hardened that echo chamber by kicking someone out.
They absolutely just proved his point.
And he's got sections in here like the non-discriminatory ways to reduce the gender gap. And if you've not seen him speak or looked into it further, it's very. I'm sure there are a lot of people that have an idea in their head of what this guy's like, and he's all right and all this stuff. He's a nerd. He's like an autistic. Like he's very high. It's very clear he's one of these very like intelligent, processing, analytical minds that is not great with probably interpersonal skills and things like that. One of these nerd coders, and he's looking at this, I would imagine, in like a very technical, like it's a problem to be solved. They're getting these new initiatives that they're pushing internally. He's seeing what their mission statement is. Didn't they say that the woman who came out and initially addressed this internally, that she had just been hired as like the new diversity officer, something like that?
Yeah.
So This is clearly something that internally they're identifying as, and they're common in most companies. When I was with ADP, they had one, and they push that down your throat constantly. But this is Google. These guys are the best of the best in terms of fixing problems. So they're pushing out there that there's this issue. He's coming at it from like a very almost like scientific position, and the response is not with logic, or it's just get out of here. This is bigoted. This is hate, and so
there's been a lot of people who've mentioned this, and they have prognosticated that there is a ton of companies that are going the social justice warrior route with overdoing diversity training, overdoing minority hiring, and all sorts of stuff like that, and that it's cannibalizing these companies, and that it's going to significantly affect the productivity, the profitability of these companies. So,
because you're getting away from the end product.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
all that matters.
Right. And that's why I thought this paper was done very well, because he lists the grievances, but again, it was geared towards how can we make Google better. And the fact that they just outright rejected that tells me they're not really concerned. And maybe they're such a mega corporation, they have so much money that they can afford to do this. They don't give a rat's ass whether or not, and that may be the case. But you're going to see lots and lots of companies, not just Google, that if they continue to go down this route, kicking out reasonable, logical individuals like this guy, those companies are going to go down the tubes.
Or they don't kick them out, because most it's not going to be too often that you find someone like this guy to put together a 10-page paper and circulate it. And it was only after that it was leaked that it really became a problem. And according to him, and this isn't an end all, but according to him, he did not even hear of any issues with the paper. It wasn't until he was on the outside,
right.
And then supposedly there was this big outcry. But it's not like he was receiving all this hate and there was this all this strife internally.
I think he said he circulated the memo a month or two beforehand, and it was it went around to a bunch of people, but it was no big deal. Everybody who he spoke to about it, everyone who read it, was fine with it. But at some point, it got out of his inner circle, I guess, and that's when the problem started. That's when people started tweeting about it, and that's ultimately what led to his termination. But just to reiterate what Rob said, throughout this entire memo, he had qualifying statements, very conciliatory qualifying statements, just like you said, this is not to be applied to an individual person. These are stereotypes, and I think we should get into a little bit of what the substance of the thing. I'm just going to read a couple quotes from the memo. At Google, we talk so much about unconscious bias as it applies to race and gender, but we rarely discuss our moral biases. And here he's discussing that a lot of the moral biases come from a leftist perspective. And, this is the social justice warrior type perspective that permeates Silicon Valley. These tech giants.
He doesn't say SJW, does he?
No, he doesn't say that. This is my commentary after the quote that I just said. Another one, he said, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, Google's left bias has created a politically correct monoculture that maintains its hold by shaming dissenters into silence. And this is exactly what this is here. This, he literally quoted what happened to him directly after this memo got leaked out. That is exactly what happened. He was shamed to the point that he was fired. He was fired because there were people on Twitter complaining about this, crying about this. There were girls and boys, men and women, whatever, they were saying, "Oh, I can't go to work tomorrow because this is violence against me." There were literally people considering this memo violence. And by the way, we're going to link to this memo, and I strongly suggest you read the entire thing from front to back. And when this was initially leaked, by the way, this James Damore, he included a lot of citations, a lot of sources, and when they initially leaked it, they removed all these citations and all the sources. They made it they made this thing look less credible than it actually was.
They made it seem like it was his opinion and it wasn't based on any actual research.
Exactly. And he provided quite a bit of I mean, not quite a bit, but he provided the necessary citations to show that, hey, this guy is not just talking out of his ass. There were literally, quite a bit of, papers that were, peer-reviewed and, actual statistics that he was citing. And, all it was talking about was the differences between men and women on an average basis, that women tend certain ways and men tend other ways, and maybe one of you guys want to talk about that.
So this wasn't a race thing, because I know this is like
this is a gender thing.
So
no race whatsoever.
Thing, yeah.
So this was the differences between men and women, right. and what did he serve? What was he trying to explain?
He was trying to explain why women, because there's always this thing in the ether right now, in the zeitgeist, that women are not enough in the STEM fields. Women aren't in coding. Women aren't in, all the engineering, that kind of stuff, right?
Pay gap, obviously.
And the pay gap is a big part of it. So he's addressing why women are underrepresented in certain job types, overrepresented in others, and he's basically just showing that with some of these studies, the traits that women and men exhibit. The traits that women and men exhibit are, different, but it kind of explains the disparities in the jobs, and why a certain percentage are in one job and a certain percentage are in other jobs.
So he's laying out sort of the laying down a groundwork of like what we understand are differences about the sexes, what the science, what the data is. I would imagine, because I haven't read the memo, so coming at this from you guys have looked through it. I'm just sort of asking questions. So he's look, this is what we know about men and women. Here are the differences. Here's the data. Even if we're not going to be using interpretation at this point, right. We know men are doing this, women are doing that. Now we need to think about whether or not this is a total social construct and a result of oppression, or is it something more natural and deeper happening? And I would imagine from there he transitions into what we're doing with that information and how that leads to a more or less productive Google. Right?
That's exactly what he does. That's 100% right.
So
what are some of his his observations and then advisements?
Before we get to that, there's one thing that he brought up in here as a way to maintain a open environment for discussion, especially when it comes to diversity. And the thing that he mentions is
fire anybody with questions.
No, it says we need to demoralize, not like demoralize. Don't make it a moral argument. And that's kind of like I said before, the whole basis of this is improving the quality of things at Google for the people and the company. So to him, this is not a moral argument. The gender gap or the representation of women in STEM fields. This is not, there's not some boogie monster out there trying to hold women down, is what he's saying. He's saying this is not a moral argument. These are not moral things that we're discussing here. I'm just discussing the validity of the program, of the diversity programs that we have. We're spending a lot of money on these diversity programs to train and hire specific people for specific roles, and we encourage particular groups of people for specific roles. We provide access training for them, and we don't for others.
Exactly. I just want to reiterate what you just said. One of the main points is that, yes, there are certain programs that they put forward that are only available to certain groups.
Right.
Women can only attend certain seminars.
Right.
Different minorities can only attend other seminars. Like basically, white males are excluded from some of these seminars.
So we're saying, and I don't mean to get too much into the weeds for those that aren't familiar with like this kind of like language, but what you're seeing here, in effect, whether they know it or not, because I have questions about how many followers actually understand the roots of this stuff, but you're seeing the postmodernist structure at work within Google, where you have the oppressed classes, right? And then you have the oppressors, and it's sort of a natural thing. Like as the white male in the organization, you have privileges, right? And so whether you mean to or not, you have access to those privileges, and you're oppressing the others. And so that's usually used as the justification for remedies, whether they be access to certain programs, whether they be just, I've seen some people, definitely some much harsher propositions, like straight up just paying certain groups more money based on the fact that there was affirmative action. Kind of is a similar concept, right?
Right.
Yeah, I would imagine anyone with like a thinking brain, this doesn't stand up to like analytical rigor,
right?
You know, and so it's almost amusing to watch like somebody go into this probably naively as a nerd, tackling this from like a technical standpoint and coming out with this paper that breaks it down all plainly. And you know, an organization like Google needs to look at this, and it's Google, so they should elevate this type of thinking.
They're the master of analytics.
They're the master, but at the same time they have this, I would argue, poisonous
they're
ideology.
looking through a lens.
Yeah, and they look, if you have a diversity leader and a diversity like mission as part of your overall mission, you're poisoning the well, and this is sort of an outgrowth of that.
Yeah, and you know, back to my point. I just wanted to finish my point.
Sorry.
He mentions about demoralizing issues. He said, you know, part of the reason why people have issues coming out at Google, speaking on conservative topics or just expressing different opinions, is that the criticism is not "you're wrong," or, you know, the data doesn't support that, or this is bad for business. The argument is always, you're a bad person. You're against minorities. You're against women.
You're harming
You're a
me.
bigot.
You're attacking
harming me. Exactly. So his point is, look, we have to, when we have conversations, ideological conversations on the left and right, we have to stop with the morality. We have to stop with the you're a bad person, I'm a bad person, you're a good person because you believe in this. We need to have a discussion as to what the perspectives are, what the topic is, what the evidence is it good, is it bad? If you view the person across the table from you that you're having a discussion as an immoral person, you're not going to accept a bit of information from them at all. You're just going to completely block them off. So his whole point, one of the points that he makes in here about demoralization, I think is huge. And I think it's really important, not just for this, but for everybody to take that, because I have the tendency to do that too. You have somebody who you know, who you disagree with on a ton of things, and you have a negative opinion of them. So when they speak to you, they may be speaking truth to you, but you kind of block it out because you see them as this immoral character. So I think that's a really valuable thing that he brings up there that a lot of people are missing.
Yeah, people miss that, and I think the thing about that is, I've heard this said that in every argument there's mostly someone is right and someone is wrong. It's just a matter of who has the most information. But if everybody has an equal amount of information, someone is right, you know?
Right.
And I think about that, and I also think about the fact that there are people that I love, people that I respect, people that I've been friends with or family members of mine that clearly have differing opinions on these things. Now, are they immoral people? No. Like I said, I love these people, and I don't love people who are immoral. I love people, you know, I care about people who are good people, you know? So it's just a matter of, like you said, instead of this moral posturing, you know, you talk to people, you present your argument, they present their argument. At some point, somebody's going to be right, somebody's going to be wrong. But it's this, and it is a leftist tendency.
Well, you know, too, and I think he kind of naively puts it at, you know, kind of, well, and maybe he's not naive about it. Maybe he's just putting it this way so people will accept his argument of demoralizing topics.
That's possible.
But I think he knows full well the reason why people bring in the moral aspect, you're a bad person, is because they have no argument against it. That's why.
Maybe, but it's amusing to me reading this again and listening to all the commentary about it. And I've watched a little bit of an interview with him after the fact, and he talks about the left a little bit and the progressives in a way that shows that he maybe is kind of naive. To me, this almost strikes me as like an epiphany moment for him, where he genuinely was like naive coming into this, and he's just like pointing out like, hey, the emperor has no clothes. Like, yo, you see this, right? Oh, let me like put out this memo and this will fix everything. Look at all the logic. Like, it's infallible. What you know, let's fix this and move on with society. And that's the whole point of the left. That's the whole progressive postmodernist ideology. And to point that out is, one, it's obvious to anyone paying attention, and two, it's also obvious that the response is not going to be, oh, this is something to think about. This is something that adds to the canon, and we're going to consider this, and it's going to be, you know, no, they're going to destroy you for it because there's no conversation happening. The reason that this podcast kind of exists, and a reason that the alternative media has had a lot of success in the last couple of years is because there's a divide, I think, developing in the West between people who want to have conversations and actually get to solutions and people who want to shut down those conversations and are going for power grabs any way that they can. And he's kind of thrown himself into the middle of this, I think,
inadvertently.
Yeah, just not really like with that being the intention. And we're seeing the fallout of that. And every time I read an analysis of this or a take on it, I just kind of start thinking at it through that lens. Are you really caring about the topic? Are you really are you citing what he said, or is this a pure ideological, your team versus my team, and this is a tool, and we're going to move the football in this direction, kind of thing. And I think once you kind of understand that paradigm, you start seeing all the actions of the way that this is interpreted and what happens, through that lens, and it makes a lot more sense, because it's hard to argue. Like, most of the arguments he's making have been made over and over and over again. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not. Listen. Are interesting to read about the biological differences between men and women, and why the gender pay gap is not really a pay gap and is a natural outgrowth of differences and lifestyle choices and all these things. So no, go ahead, Kasam.
No, the arguments have been made, but I think on more than that, most people are not hearing those arguments.
That's a good point.
I think a lot of people are hearing, the diversity, multiculturalism, all the other, buzzwords that the leftist type people like to throw out. But I just want to go through a little bit of what is actually in here.
Real quick, so before you go into the specifics, you're right. But sorry, because we jump around. But is it counterproductive? I don't know. Maybe they felt they didn't have a choice. But is it counterproductive for, let's call it the left, and those that advocated for his firing, for this to happen? Because for as much as that side cheers because he got fired, now there's more conversation happening about things. This is my argument in big picture. There's more conversation happening about the content and whether or not this was definitely just, and things that would have been swept under the rug and just kind of, now people are talking about it.
I think it's extremely productive for this to happen for people like us, for people who care about discourse, for people who care about liberty, freedom, for people who don't buy into this whole postmodernist type mentality. I think it's quite productive. But for them, I think they're so blinded.
I don't mean it convincing them, but I mean in like the people in the middle who have not made up their minds. I feel like something like this harms the left more than hurts it.
That's what I'm saying. I agree too.
I think something like this pushes people in the middle, or it makes people in the middle realize how crazy some of the people on the far left really and truly are. I think people in the middle normally are in the middle because they don't really give a shit, because they're too busy doing other things. They're not paying attention.
Why do I care
living
about
life?
But then they see something like this, and this is not a long thing. They take 10 minutes on their lunch break. They read and they go, "This is perfectly reasonable. What the heck happened?" These people
why is this a national news story?
Exactly. Right? And to your point. Yeah, they made a huge deal out of this. This was an internal memo that got circulated for a month within Google. If they had just left it at that, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. Like now, it's all over the place. We're talking about it. It's all over Facebook. It's all over Twitter. It
makes me wonder. It's almost like this was leaked by someone on the right, or is not a leftist. Like with that in mind, there are people that do that. That's a 4G kind of move.
Yeah, that's a very 4G kind of move.
So
I don't think there's anybody in Google with that sort of
Google's big, man.
Political slant and that sort of.
But sorry, I agree, because I want to hear more about his actual arguments.
Yeah, let's go into the substance. Sorry, this is a little late in coming, but hopefully you're still listening. The substance is essentially women and men are different on average, and this has been proven with data, in studies. So here's the studies that he cites. The basic thing is that women are more open. They have stronger interests in people rather than things, whereas men, are more interested in ideas and problem solving, that kind of stuff. This explains why women generally prefer jobs in social or artistic areas, whereas men are more into things like coding, that type of thing. Another aspect of it is that women are not very assertive when compared to men. Men are very assertive. Women are more agreeable. So in
a hyper-competitive environment, that's not to your advantage.
Yes, and in this area, like we were saying, he qualifies all his statements because he knows his audience, at least somewhat. He says, Note that these are just average differences and there's overlap between men and women, but this is seen solely as a women's issue. This leads to exclusionary programs for women, and men are left without those kind of programs because of the biases of Google.
And this is where he shows a chart for this, right? Or
he shows a chart.
A graph.
He also says women are higher anxiety and they have lower stress tolerance, which is why men are more willing to get into higher stress jobs. Also, men are interested more in status. They want to be, they want to, it's a biological thing. They have to attract a mate, so they need to be high on the scale. It's a primate thing, honestly.
And an alpha thing. I mean,
it's an alpha thing.
You see it in the wild constantly.
Yes.
The battle to move up that hierarchy it seems to me like it's a very male thing within like the tribes or whatever, if it's monkeys or hippos or wherever it is.
Exactly. I mean, this is seen across all species, especially mammalian species, but others as well. And
one of the, if I can jump in here, one of the things that he put in here that I thought was actually pretty funny, because being a early 30s male working in a big company,
don't forget weight and cis.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for reminding the audience of that. I've thought about this quite a bit, is work-life balance. And he actually has a line in here that says, women have a greater tendency to have a more balanced, happy, I think he even uses like the word satisfying or happy life than men do. Essentially alluding to the fact that if you want to be a high executive or you want to have a high position in the company, you're not going to see your kids often. You're not going to see your wife often. You're not going to have a balanced life. You're not going to have a social life and a work life. It's pretty much just going to be work all the time. And it just appears that men pursue that significantly more than women do, because they put more emphasis on that.
So I would assume that all these things, so if these are presented as like extractions of the data, then those on the left would argue that these are the result of social oppression and construct, and not biological causes.
Right.
And so he
cites and gives examples from evolutionary biology or other species where the same sort of behaviors are seen.
Like perhaps testosterone has something to do with
so he talks about prenatal testosterone levels influencing some of these characteristics and a number of other things. So he talks about, you see these sort of you see these characteristics across species, not just in humans, and you also see them across cultures and across time. So it's significantly more indicative of a biological trait than a social construct.
Right. And it's almost like the pursuit of happiness, because happiness is sort of a funny evolutionary thing too. Like the sensation of being happy is real. That's not like, you see a dog happy and then not happy, and there's hormones and chemicals being released for that. And so you think about the things that make you happy or not happy. It's almost like the pursuit of those things for men and women are different.
Right.
And then when it just so happens to come to the marketplace, the things that make men happy are valued more, or at least at this moment in times, in terms of like monetary payment. And by the way, I don't even know if that is true on a per hour basis, because I know men work many more hours than women in more dangerous positions. Right. But I'm just sort of following the logic through there. Right. That could be one like reasonable explanation for why you would have.
Yeah,
these
being a father of a year and a half old daughter, I venture to guess, and I feel like people who think that a lot of the differences in outcomes or differences between men or women are simply social constructs and have nothing to do with biology, or more social construct than biological predisposition, have not had children. Because you have a little boy or you have a little girl, oh my goodness, before they're even exposed to anything, you can already see the female and male tendencies in these children. So, it's just, of course, that's anecdotal from my experience, but I feel like anybody who's had kids, and even among siblings, you can just look amongst your siblings. You have a brother, you have a sister, so different between two siblings. Even identical twins are very different. Fraternal twins become very different. So the idea that there would not be significant differences in outcomes and personal preferences and behavior between two different sexes in the same species is insane.
Especially if you believe in evolution.
Yeah, exactly.
If you wanted to say you don't believe in evolution, then okay, fine. And we're playing a different game.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, where are we going from there?
I'll also add, probably edited to make it seem smooth. I'll also add that, and again, I can't cite this. I've just heard it repeated a couple times, but that in primates and in other species, prepubescent apes will take a piece of driftwood or something, and if it's a little girl, it'll treat it as a baby in a way that a little girl plays with a doll. And I think a lot of times, again, the progressives try to make this argument that the reason that a little girl plays with a doll is because that's the social, that's the nurture, not the nature. So, yet we see in nature. Now I don't know if they make an argument that that's a social construct in nature too. I think that's probably harder to sell, but you see similar behaviors in it seems like in primates as well that get attributed to social constructs in humans.
Let's just follow the hypothesis that all of this is a social construct. So then the real question you have to ask yourself is it better for it not to be? So is it actually more beneficial for women, for society, for people, for there to be more women in tech? I mean, we have this idea that we should have, 50-50 men and women, but that might not be ideal. If we had 50-50 men and women trying to give birth to all the children on the planet, we would have a problem because men can't do it, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to answer the question. So the first question is, well, is it biological or is it cultural? To me, that almost doesn't matter. The real question, or the question, especially that this paper is kind of alluding to, is it more valuable? Okay, let's say there is a gap, there is a gap in women's representation in STEM field or technology. Is it actually beneficial? The first question: do women really want more representation in the STEM field? Go ask the average woman. Do you want more women represented? You have to ask them personally. Do you want to? Do you want to be in the STEM field? Okay, because I think if you did that survey, you would find personal preferences from all the women. Most women don't want to be in the STEM field. But
because they've been beaten down to the point where they feel discouraged because they don't have testosterone, that socially they're not comfortable going into the STEM fields because they're going to be made to feel alienated. They're made to think that that's not something that they should pursue. This would be the argument. This is the argument.
But if you phrase the question to them, what are you interested in? Are you interested in computer design or are you interested in curtains? What would the answer that you get? That might seem, it's stereotypical, sort of, but it's highlighting my point. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. So the first thing is you got to ask women, and don't ask women, do you want other women to be in that? Because that's that's a ridiculous question. Ask the woman, do you want to go into the STEM field?
So real question yes. on that. So you say we got to ask, do we actually want more women in
Is it beneficial?
STEM? Is it beneficial?
There's this idea that it's everything has to be perfectly equal. Nobody has answered to me why that's beneficial for anyone. Well, for men, for women, for society in general.
Again, I don't think the argument is that it's quote beneficial. I mean, that's a very weird concept anyway, right? Yeah, we're viewing humanity and society in the absolute aggregate and what's the most efficient proportions of all these different things. I think the argument is, right or wrong, that there's oppression, and the reason that we don't have a perfect representation of the population of women and men in every field, in every aspect of society, is because of some sort of social construct, lack of diversity, some sort of ancient mindset that is left over that we've not shaken the shackles from, slavery, and that in some utopian near future we're going to achieve that. And so that's the purpose of these diversity groups, is to, because that's a question in and of itself. Is the purpose of these diversity groups and these companies, and again, I was at ADP, they had one of these, and even before I looked into these issues, it felt wrong to me, the concept here, because they never explicitly, is the purpose of diversity for a better company, for better output, for better product?
This is the question I'm asking.
Is it for the employee?
This is the question I'm asking.
Is it because there's oppression?
Right.
Is it what is the purpose of quote diversity?
Right. I think it's to make people feel better.
Right, but my question, right? So
but they wouldn't say that.
If that's the answer, does it actually make people feel better?
I don't think so. I mean,
are the people that are going to be in that position, in that field, working in that job, going to be happier? Are there women out there? Is there a significant portion of women out there who legitimately are pursuing STEM degrees and STEM jobs that are upset.
That's the argument, yes.
Because there's a glass ceiling. Really? I haven't seen any
That's
of
the
these
argument,
women
yeah.
coming out and making these arguments.
I've
seen all these people, these social justice warriors who don't have degrees in math or science or any of this kind of stuff. There's
masculinity in these industries, in these fields.
I got to be honest with you. It seems kind of crazy to me for people, especially, to choose the STEM fields, okay? Who are the least masculine... what's the least masculine job you could have? Computer programmer, for Christ's sake. This guy's a freaking computer engineer. This is Google. Go over there. None of these guys got biceps or triceps. They don't go to the gym. They're all a bunch of nerds.
Maybe they talk a lot. Maybe there's a lot of dick jokes.
So you mean to tell me that if you tested the testosterone level between the average firefighter and the average coder, I would guarantee you the average firefighter would have significantly higher testosterone levels. So it seems strange to me that they specifically target the STEM fields for doctors, for engineers, for software coders, for all these.
Well, they're not going to talk about
not
garbage
so
men,
traditionally masculine men.
Yeah, they're not right. No.
What about construction workers? How come they're not targeting construction workers? We should have more women in construction workers. Probably talk the worst about women and probably have the most misogynistic views of women.
No, but aren't you arguing against yourself? Because maybe that's like even too much for them, where they can argue, look, testosterone is a real thing, and maybe there are some barriers against women in those things, and we should definitely fight those. But we see more men in construction because men do have a greater natural ability to build muscle, and that's required for construction. That's why you see more of them. But in the STEM fields, it's all brains. So why the disparity?
Because there is an IQ gap between men and women.
Oh, well, see, we got to something.
They have different cognitive strengths and weaknesses.
So men are better.
Yes, it's very clear. There's been tons and tons of studies that indicate that men.
Well, then talk about this a little bit.
They have significant, not significantly, but in an aggregate. Again, it's a bell curve. But men typically have slightly higher cognitive abilities when it comes to math and science and logic and reasoning. Women have significantly higher abilities to multitask than men do. Men do, in general, do a better job concentrating on one complex, difficult task, and women do a significantly better job, on the whole, in general, executing a number of less complicated tasks simultaneously. This has been proven. This is not even debatable in the psychological research or the neurological research that's been done on this sort of thing. So that's the argument. Okay, if you have, jobs that require single solitary concentration on a complex, logical, mathematic topic, then those who have a higher IQ or a higher cognitive ability in that area obviously are going to gravitate towards that and be more successful.
And even though there's a lot of overlap in a company like Google, where they're taking from the best of the best of the best of the best,
right,
that's where it's going to be predominantly the men. Because, by the way, the other part of this bell curve, as I understand it, is that there are more geniuses that are men than women, but there are also more dummies and fuck-ups that are men. Right. The men tend to be more spread.
Yes.
Whereas the women tend to congregate more towards the middle. So you have more Nobel-winning prize winners that are men, but you have 90% of all people in jail that are men, which a lot of that is violence, but homeless population, and again, just
all sorts of
degenerates and whatever mental illnesses,
autism.
This is going to be boys as well. And we're not, of course, we're not going to focus on that part of the graph. We're just going to focus on the part that we don't like, which is the one up top.
Right.
So that's interesting. So my question, I guess, getting back to this paper is, I don't think he goes into all of this in 10 pages, right? I would imagine this is a bit of an overload for the Google memo, right? So how much does he go into this sort of stuff, and what are some of his prescriptions for actually fixing whatever he perceives or he perceives as the issues in response to what the diversity group at Google perceives as the problems to be solved?
One of the main ones that off the top of my head that I remember is that he talks about how women are better at cooperative ventures. And so he says that instead of trying to force women into coding positions where they have to code something on their own, why don't we change the position and make it cooperative coding? And we code, like, it's a group that codes things together, as opposed to one guy codes one thing, one guy codes another. So he prescribes that. I'm not sure what else, but most of it involved basically recognizing these differences between the genders and structuring the jobs,
leveraging them such
that you change the structure of the job to accommodate the differences, rather than just try to force a woman into a job.
We're not even accommodating. That sounds like taking advantage. Hey, we have women in our coding group. we're going to get more out of that team if we structure them to work cooperatively, whereas the men, if we put in a little silos, that we're going to get the most out of them.
Right. Yeah.
That seems like a pure output like calculation.
That's honestly the way he approaches this whole thing. Aside from all the qualifying statements and trying to be as nice as he can be, he is also definitely trying to put this out for the benefit of the company. You can see that throughout the whole read. He wants to benefit the company. He wants to improve upon the issues that he feels are the problems, all these diversity trainings, all this whole diversity mentality that goes through the whole company. He's trying to fix it. He's trying to say, hey, this is not the way to go. I loved it. He said it on an interview I heard. He really loves Google. He loves what they do. He loves what they've done.
Aside from this, I hear it's a great, like the best place to work.
Yeah. But he's like, hey, I think this is a problem. This is a road we're heading down that is not the best road. Here's how we could fix it. And here's also, it's not like a, I don't know, there's no hate involved. There's no malice. He's like, yo, this is what we need to do to just fix this. These are blind spots that we have because of this left bias that Google has.
Well, he even talks in here, and he talks about the pros and cons. He even talks about the biases of the left, the biases of the right, the pros of left ideology, the pros of right ideology, and the pros and cons of the differences of personalities between men's and women. And he even advocates, he even acknowledges there's tons of unconscious bias and that Google consistently talks about unconscious bias. And he advocates for more training and research for unconscious bias as to how they can use it to better promote their products. He's saying we're giving diversity training and unconscious bias to coders. Why? What the heck does that affect the coder?
This guy's trying to control society, and Google's not even, they just let this guy go.
So, it's... I would just encourage. It's not a really difficult piece to read. I would really encourage everyone to just go read it themselves. And just a comment on the way he put it together, the way it was structured, and the way he wrote it. I thought it was excellent because he was specific in where the details mattered, and then where he didn't really need to go into the absolute details because everyone agrees on it. He was just general enough and quick enough to make it a quick read. This could have been a 50-page paper, but he made it like 10. It was like no problem. So he did an excellent job with that, which is also, I'm a little surprised. The level of communication and the language that he uses in here is absolutely excellent. It's very clear. It's very descriptive. It's very concise. It's not superfluous as I can be many times. And I'm surprised to see that from someone who's, an engineer or a tech-based guy, because as a project manager, a lot of my engineers, the biggest problem they have is communication. But this was very well written. And I found out later, like I said, he's done research and stuff like that. And it was written like a very well-read, well-written, well-researched research paper. But it's easy to read, so I encourage everyone to read it.
Yeah, so that's the content of the thing, and I think I just want to step back from the letter, and I kind of want to just, if we're talking about hate here on this podcast and not wasting it. I mean,
so why should people care about this?
Why should people care about this? Well, the thing that pisses me off about it, because
this is Google. Companies make stupid mistakes all the time. They fire people they shouldn't all the time. They certainly promote people that they shouldn't all the time. So why is in society in the West should we care about this?
Like I said, I don't care what Google does. If they want to fire people for this garbage, that's their own thing. I don't care. But the thing that I care about is all these. The women who came out and the men who came out who basically wanted to virtue signal. And they like I said before, there are people coming out saying that this was a violent act, that there were people who couldn't go to work because this was circulating around Google in the memos.
People at Google were saying that, or people at their other jobs were saying.
There were people who worked at Google who went on Twitter and said it. There were former employees, current employees who literally said they considered this an act of violence and that they
did they get therapy
scared
puppies
to
for
go
them?
to work. I hope they did.
Do you know who would consider this an act of violence? Very low testosterone weenie coders. Again, to my point, I find it hard to believe that there's this massive masculine oppressive culture from men who are so soft that a 10-page paper written very well is so offensive. They get so offended they can't come to work.
You mean there's not a lot of mass gainer in a coffee room?
I don't think so.
I don't know, man. I just think when you look at people who freak out about shit like this, you have to wonder where they're coming from. And literally, I think you really have to wonder, how dumb are these people? Because I was Thomas Sowell is a dude who I like in certain aspects, and one thing he always says, whenever you're looking at some kind of crazy left-wing ideology, there's a few questions you need to ask, and one of those questions is, compared to what, right? So, okay, women are so underrepresented, women are oppressed, women are this and that, you know, the whole thing in this article, and in this podcast, and the whole reason that people had this uproar, how could someone consider this violence, right, is compared to what? Like, why are you freaking out about something that, you know, compare yourself to women 30 years ago. Compare yourself to women 60 years ago. Compare yourself to women 100 years ago.
Compare yourself to contemporaries in other geographic locations.
Compare yourself to Saudi Arabia. Compare yourself to anywhere else.
Compare yourself to Mexico. You don't even have to go to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, you don't have to go to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, go to Mexico. Go to a lot of different places in the world. What's life like for women there? And what's life like for women here? And I don't think you see women in these places or women back in those other time periods freaking out to this point. I think most women in this society would be pretty happy with it. Pretty happy with where they're at.
But are you saying that they should be satisfied with being oppressed less than at other times in history and other places in the world? Or that those that are like debilitated by the knowledge of this information out there are full of shit? And that there's clearly is that you're the freest and most empowered, women in all of human history, and yet you're like being totally crippled by a memo.
Well, I'm saying
because I could see the first one, even though I'm
not saying that everything's perfect now. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is we are on a trajectory, and we've been on a trajectory for quite a long time, and that trajectory is toward more rights, more freedom for all, women, men, different minorities included. So instead of concentrating on Google and this memo in Google that's circulating around that you consider violent to the point where you can't get to work, why don't you stand up and talk about what's going on in these other countries where women are totally behind where you are? Because American women are the most free, the most privileged women that have ever existed in this entire humankind's history, unless there was some crazy society pre-Atlantis or some shit that we don't know about because it got swallowed up by the ocean.
Yeah, I would find it hard to believe that any woman in the Middle East would sympathize with, the plight of the American woman, working woman who's like crying in her corner in a fetal position because of this memo.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. And there's no women calling out the Muslim world for their treatment of women. They're calling out the nerdy programmer on Google because he sent out a 10-page memo, questioning whether we should, just force everyone into certain positions based on their percentage of the population.
So I think what he's ultimately trying to say is, don't waste your hate.
Yeah, you're fucking wasting your hate on something here.
There are so many larger injustices for women, not even just in other countries, but in the United States, rather than this 10-page memo written by a guy. It's like you're wasting your time on this. This is not offensive.
Without question, which is why when we were going to cover this, I almost felt like, is it a waste of time? Really because it really is. This just seems like very like going through the motions for the progressives. This is the expected reaction. Like you could set your watch to, CNN's response and all the responses and what you're going to get out of the mainstream. Fortunately, now there's this great alternative media where he's already out there and doing interviews and defending himself, and you're having a little bit of a response. Totally agree with everything you said in big picture. Give me a break. I can't help but think even bigger picture and say, you have the people who are following sort of not mindlessly, but there's only so many things that you could dive super deep into in life, and most of the people that are sympathizing with the left on this don't really grasp the sorry to keep using this like postmodernist or like social Marxism like concept, but it's why you have the left aligning themselves with like Islam, for example, and not acknowledging the oppressions over there, and why that, if that seems strange to you, it's because it's in the context of the oppressed and the oppressor, and trying to rebalance that, and all of society should be structured in that order. And this is and why I later came to realize, and especially during this conversation, that this does matter, is because now this memo is part of this culture war, which has taken root in the West, especially, of who's going to sort of win this battle, as those on the left, even though they're being exposed, they do seem to be gaining power. I am very concerned of it. They certainly took over a number of institutions, including politics for a long time, Hollywood, education. It's not like they're out of there. Silicon Valley, obviously, all the mainstream outlets.
But they've been taking some losses.
Oh, they've been
taking a lot of losses recently. This is just one.
They've been the Tyrion of late, just taking tallying up the L's after every move, and sort of not understanding why. And suddenly you're getting these big Republican majorities because they're the loud ones. Like at Google, you have an organization that was probably most people probably didn't give a fuck about this. Yeah. Then you had a lot of people that was like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. You had a lot of people who are like, yeah, this is on the money, but you're an idiot for saying this and circulating it. And then you had the shrill, loud minority that freaks the fuck out, right?
Right.
They get all the attention. They pressure them to fire them. They're the ones that get these diversity groups. And so along with this being, I think, now a critical part of the culture war and a discussion point and a great way for those in the center that are trying to work this out. You're trying to convince people of your views and other views. This is now something to talk about, right? And you got to sort of decide, well, where do I really stand on this, right? And where, people are one side or the other side is gaining traction. The other reason why I think this matters. Motherfucker! Why can't I hold two thoughts in my head for more than a second?
Well, let me chime in here for you. Everything, I agree with everything that you said about where the leftist ideology comes from, how they view the world, their worldview, and why this is their response to that. I think this is very helpful for the person in the middle who doesn't really give a shit or doesn't really pay attention, because it's so blatantly obvious. Anybody could pick this up and take 5 minutes on a lunch break, read this, and go, anyone who's opposed to this is a nutcase. And they don't have to go through all that. They don't have to understand where the radical left is coming from to simply read this and say, well, if you think this is like insane, or this is violence, or this is provocative, or this is mean, or this is sexist, then you're a nutcase in general. And they can just exclude them from rational discussion right off the bat. So it's a shortcut. These types of things are shortcuts for the people who wouldn't normally follow this type of stuff and get into the weeds, to just say, to just see. It's just putting it right out there for people to see. Wow, these people are nuts. Forget it.
That's why I asked earlier if this wasn't counterproductive for those on the left. If they were almost like, oh man, I wish this would go out. But I remember the other point. So the other reason why I think this matters a little bit is because they talked about how now he's pursuing potential like retaliatory or defensive measures for being fired. Now look, I'm of the opinion that when someone decides to hire you, that's a voluntary arrangement. And if they want to terminate that at any time for any point, then that's the end of it. It's their money. They don't have to pay you. You have no additional rights because you were hired. Definitely a minority view, but one that I'm fairly confident in. So the fact that Google wants to fire him, as far as I'm concerned, whatever the reason, which is bullshit, but whatever the reason, is within their right. It's their money. Okay, well, it's their money. Okay, and I want to hear your counterpoint, but it's their money. They are deciding suddenly that they don't want to pay this guy anymore for whatever reason, and that's their prerogative. Where I worry about this, though, is you have these giant HR departments in every company, right? And their job, among other things, is to make sure that they limit the risk of lawsuit as much as humanly possible, as much as legally possible. Yep. And that means that even if they all agree that this was a totally benign thing and it's totally fine and it's something that they even want to promote, if they're worried about a lawsuit that could win, even if there's a 20% or 15% chance that it can win, but it's a substantial lawsuit. You have the PR aspect of it. Maybe they don't want to be like the social leaders on this sort of thing. They just want to go about their business. That factors into the decision to fire them. And now you're involving the state on something where it's not simply a free speech issue. And you're bringing in the state apparatus, which is, I would argue that if someone were to win a lawsuit because they felt as if they were physically harmed because of this memo going out, that is illegitimate and an inappropriate use of the state, and that in a private system, replacing the state, let's say, that would not hold water.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's another aspect to this, which I think is nefarious and people need to think about when talking about free speech issues in general. So that's one caveat I'll add to the...
Yeah, so to your point that Google has the right to hire and fire whoever they want, I agree with that, except for the fact that he signed an employment contract that has terms and conditions of his employment and terms for appropriate dismissal or...
Did he?
He did. Right. So supposedly Google cited the fact that he violated their code of conduct, which prohibits sexist talk or sexist comments. Okay. Now, again, I encourage people to read this. There's nothing sexist about this. There's absolutely nothing sexist about this. This is completely logical. This is completely cited. This is based in research. Maybe the research is wrong. Maybe the research is skewed. But you cannot call somebody who's citing academic studies and research as a sexist opinion. It's not. It's he's citing information. Okay, so. And this brings me to a bigger point and the left does this all the time, is they use redefinition of the language to essentially do whatever it is that they want. So they're redefining the word sexist to mean anything that might portray women as not being completely equal in every way, shape, or form with men. But
Even
that's
if
not
it's some kind of scientific
exactly.
data
But that's not the
proving
that's not the definition of the word
hate facts.
sexist.
Hate facts.
Yeah, exactly. Again, and this is an example of, and you see it everywhere where the left redefines language. They redefine what racism is. Racism used to be, just being
pretty clear cut.
Yeah, but it was pretty clear cut. There was no question whether someone was racist or not. Somebody wasn't 5% racist. They were racist. Now it's like, oh, you had a thought in your head. You looked at this person a weird way. You're racist. It's like
there is a little microaggressions out there.
They've tried to take language and redefine it just to get whatever output.
I am assuming that he was employed under what a lot of people are employed under in these big companies, which is this at-will contract, which means they can fire you whenever they want.
Yep.
But there's going to be other terms attached to that, and just whether or not they're in the contract or not, there's other legal precedents that sort of govern that relationship. But I'm not privy to what his actual contract.
Yeah, and if they had come out and said we just don't need his services anymore, I would. And obviously that wouldn't be the reason why. But had they just come out and made that statement and said we don't really need his services anymore, we've terminated his employment here, then legally speaking, yes, I would think they'd be within their bounds. But they literally came out and said he violated his code of conduct per the terms of his employment.
Maybe that'll be challenged.
That's a good point.
And I think that I haven't looked at what his suit is, but they should bring
and
that
up. Could be interesting again for public discussion is digging into those terms and the language, because they're interpreting the language to mean one thing. And once lawyers get their hands on things, there's some bad legal precedents out there, but very often, like, there are certain concepts, we've talked about this in other cases, where lawyers who have actually litigated, they laugh at some of the things that gets talked about in the mainstream as far as like what would happen in a court and like what the standards are and things like that. So maybe that would be instructive as well. I don't want to see this guy get paid millions of dollars because just because he was fired. You don't have a right to work for Google.
Sure.
But that's an interesting point for sure.
Yeah, and my understanding is he's already got a number of job offers from other companies.
Well, now in 2017, there's no better time to get fired for something like this.
Absolutely.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's because everything is so separated. And my final big picture thought on this is like the left and the right have been in like these echo chambers on social media, in all these platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, everything, right? Google is YouTube. So there's all these little echo chambers, and a lot of them have been within this Google platform of YouTube. But I think things are happening now to the point where even the platforms are choosing sides themselves. So I don't think it's going to continue with oh, there's different echo chambers within Facebook, or there's different echo chambers within YouTube. I think there's essentially going to be a purge from a lot of these things, and a lot of the right-wing people, a lot of people who don't buy into this whole diversity thing, they're going to be purged. It already started with what happened with Jordan Peterson. He got kicked off of YouTube for a little while. Yeah. Milo got kicked out of Twitter a while back. You know, all these things, I think they're doubling down. All these Silicon Valley companies, they're all leftists. They're doubling down, and they're starting to kick people out. They're starting to push people out publicly now. And I think it's to their detriment ultimately, because I think now all these echo chambers are going to be completely separate.
They're going to be worse. So you're saying the echo chamber effect is going to be worse because they're going to be totally separate platforms. They're not even going to be coexisting within like YouTube or something.
Right. I don't think there's going to be people talking to each other anymore. I think it's going to get worse and not better. And I think that's going to translate to the real world. It's going to become a bigger disparity within our physical society as opposed to the digital world that we're talking about right now. I think it's going to extend beyond that. And these tensions they need to be released in some way. And, you know, it could be pretty ugly. I mean, I don't see it going the right way with all these divisions happening.
So on that very optimistic note, because that could be a whole nother great conversation, I think, about the different social media platforms and their, you know, what Anthony was talking about in terms of like the purging of different viewpoints. If you're not paying attention, that might seem outrageous. It is totally correct. It is totally documented. If you look for it even for 2 seconds, I don't even think they really hide the fact that they do this. And it's not just for extreme views. It's really getting to the point where if you just have anything that is not a PC left view, you're in the crosshairs. If you're a conservative, if you're a libertarian, if you're anything that's not, you know, in that category, you know, whether it be through demonetization, again, YouTube's it's all within like this weird hybrid of like something it's within their rights, but then what are the social costs? And also you have this like legal system like overlaying it, which you know, has all these precedents in there that are sort of unfair that they use to their advantage as well. But where the social media platforms are going to go, where's Twitter going to go? Because I personally like Twitter, and I like that everybody, it's a really vicious place to be, but it's also where these ideas that are diametrically opposed to each other and the people that stand for them, where they actually come face to face with one another. I wish people would block less, because I think even if it's an idea that you hate to hear, as long as you're not being overly like harassing or trolly, then hear it out and have it out. And I would hate to see that happen. But that's something that is definitely unfolding and should be a topic of another podcast. Anything else you guys have on this subject? I think we covered quite a bit. Definitely more than I was expecting.
I could branch off into 1,000 things, but I think that's sufficient for now.
Yeah, I think we're good. But let's just let Rob give his information.
Rob, where people can
Rob has a video blog. I don't know if we mentioned that before, but he runs his own video blog. He's got a lot of cool videos. He's got a lot of perspectives on different things. So tell us where people can find you.
Yeah, you can just go on YouTube and type in Rob's video blog, ROB''S video blog, and it's the first video that'll pop up there. I have a podcast version of the video blog. You can just go on iTunes again, type in Rob's video blog, and it's the first one that pops up.
And we'll link to that on the show notes page, as well as this memo. I'll link to a couple other posts that I read regarding the memo, but I do suggest you listen to the memo. You read the memo. It's definitely, you'll get a much clearer picture of what we were talking about, because although we hit a lot of the main points in it, I read the whole thing front and back, before I got to this conversation, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about. It's completely reasonable, and please enjoy reading it.
You on Twitter?
No, I'm not on Twitter.
Not on Twitter.
I am personally on Twitter. Rob's video blog is not on Twitter yet.
Okay, coming soon, folks. All right.
Find Don't Waste Your Hate on Twitter, at Don't Waste Hate, and also on Facebook at the same thing. Don'tWasteYourHate.com/6. We appreciate you coming out, and don't waste your hate.
Later, haters.